Is the origin of Islam simply the distortion of Christianity through the use of heretical doctrines, or was it really birthed from a true revelation of God? The Quran itself, of course, suggests that the revelation given to Muhammad is complete and absolute, rooted in pure revelation from Allah. Surah 10:37 states that it is not possible for the Quran to be from anyone but Allah. Surah 56 ayah 77 to 80 says, "Indeed it is a noble Quran, in a register well protected. None touch it except the purified. It is a revelation from the Lord of the worlds." However, many Christian church fathers have disputed this since the creation of Islam and the alleged prophethood of Muhammad in the 7th century. St. Peter the Venerable states the following about the roots of Islam in his writing summary of the entire heresy of the Saracens. Since he had heard that the prophets of God were great men, being that from the Bible, he said that he was God's prophet, and so that he might feign something good. He partly tried to lead people away from idolatry, but not to the true God, but rather to the error of his heresy that he had now begun to bring forth. Although I call these people heretics because they believe in some things with us and dissent from us in more things, it is perhaps more accurate for me to call them pagans or heathens, because although they say some truths about the Lord, they nonetheless preach more falsehoods. John of Damascus, a Byzantine monk and a doctor of the church, states the following, as we've seen in a previous video. There is also the superstition of the Ishmaelites, which to this day prevails and keeps people in error, being a forerunner of the Antichrist. This man, Muhammad, after having chanced upon the Old and New Testaments and likewise, it seems, having conversed with an Arian monk, devised his own heresy. And in general, right, the writings of the fathers, theologians, monks and priests of the time regarding Islam unanimously agree on a few things. That the origin of Islam is simply the perversion of Christianity with a mixture of major heretical doctrines alongside some fragments of truth, absent of any new revelation from God. Some even suggested that parts of Muhammad's so-called revelation came from paganism too, but that's a whole other issue in itself for a video for another time. Anyway, whether it be Byzantine fathers in the midst of Islamic expansion, such as Theophanes the Confessor and Nicetas of Byzantium, or even later critics from the West like Thomas Aquinas and Roman Lull, the understanding of the roots of Islam were clear. So, in this video we're going to investigate this further, to see why it is that the earliest Christian critics of Islam believed that the religion was built upon biblical perversion and heretical doctrines of a false prophet, rather than it being a true revelation from God. Firstly, something that's really important for us to understand is the cultural and geographical situation Muhammad found himself in well before his proclaimed prophethood. He was, according to Islamic tradition, a trusted merchant or trader in Western Arabia, specifically in the area of Hijaz, which was a crossroad and hub of trade and numerous pilgrimage routes because of its geographical location. History shows us that Christianity at the time was present throughout Arabia, but there were many unorthodox and heretical beliefs, particularly in Western Arabia at the time, due to the isolation of communities and no centre of Christian authority there. Hijaz, a pagan region and the home of Muhammad, was therefore also the crossroad of many different ideas and doctrines coming together in one place, specifically many heresy-rich, unorthodox Christian beliefs. Being illiterate himself, with an inability to read any scripture, it wouldn't be unfair to suggest, therefore, that Muhammad's understanding and formation of Christian doctrine to this point was done so through word of mouth, which in most cases, historically speaking, would have been to Christian heretics due to his location. As we've seen, Muhammad declares this to be an absolute and complete revelation from God. But we also see something else which is again super important in understanding what the earliest church fathers would have seen regarding the roots of Islam. Stick with me here. Muhammad time and time again confirms the authority, preservation and revelation of the Injil or Gospel and Torah with the Christians during the 7th century, whilst he also holds the Zabur, which is the Psalms, in high regard. Moreover, Muhammad and the Quran profess, keyword profess, to the worship of the God of Abraham. Plus there's the confirmation of the prophets following in this line of succession of descendants, which is revealed throughout the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And then to top this off, there is, even though perverted, a clear honour of sorts given to Jesus Christ, whose words the Quran again confirms are revelatory and authoritative from God. Finally, the Islamic scriptures state that Muhammad is the seal of all of these prophets, meaning therefore that the declaration is made that Muhammad is in the line of prophets from Abraham to Jesus. Why is this all relevant though? Well, everything I've just mentioned regarding the Quran's relationship with previous revelations, scriptures, prophets and Jesus suggests something which the earliest Christian critics of Muhammad would have noticed too. The Quran, and therefore Muhammad himself, makes the declaration that he has literally been sent by the same God of the 7th century Torah and Injil, the God of Abraham and Moses. Therefore, this means that the absolute foundation of the prophethood of Muhammad, according to Islamic standards, has literally rooted itself in 7th century Christianity, which was the keeper of everything revelatory within the Abrahamic faith that Muhammad made claim to. If Muhammad's revelation was truly from God, it therefore must be in line with what was previously revealed. So then, were the early church fathers wrong in stating that the origin of Islam is simply the perversion and distortion of Christianity rather than true revelation from God? Well, to answer this, the question must follow: does the Quran distort the words and previous revelation given by the God of Abraham? Firstly, let's go to Surah An-Nisa, ayah 157, which says the following: "And because of their saying, we slew or crucified the Messiah, Jesus son of Mary, Allah's messenger, they slew him not nor crucified him, but it appeared so unto them. They slew him not for certain." The previous scriptures and revelation, both Old and New Testament, clearly prophesy and teach of the crucifixion of Jesus, not to mention the historical evidence to back this up too. The death of the Son of God is pivotal and crucial to both sets of scriptures and the previous divine revelation. But here's what's interesting. The Quran stating that it was only made to appear as if he was crucified, or that it was just an illusion, wasn't actually a new line of thought at all. Surah 4 157 that I've just read mirrors the exact theology and doctrine pertaining to the crucifixion of a 2nd century condemned heresy called Docetism. What's also interesting is that some Docetists of the time didn't just hold to Christ only appearing to be crucified, but some even held to the theory that God swapped out Jesus for someone else on the cross, in the same way that many Muslims try to explain it today. St. Ignatius spoke against this heretical doctrine just decades after Jesus' resurrection and assumption into heaven. In his epistle to the Smyrnans, chapter 2, he says, "He suffered truly, just as he also truly raised himself, not, as some unbelievers say, that he suffered in appearance only." Secondly, the authority of the people of the book, the holders of divine revelation in which Muhammad refers to, the Christians, made clear through scriptural analysis and councils for hundreds of years prior to Muhammad's coming that Jesus was the divine Son of God. The sonship of Christ is literally mentioned by Jesus over 100 times throughout the 7th century Injil, which the Quran refers to. Moreover, through the Torah, Old Testament and Injil of the time, we see prophecy and account of Jesus being divine in nature. The Quran, though, denies both of these things and teaches the opposite. The Quran states clearly that Jesus was a created being and not God. Surah 575 states that he was no more than a messenger, while Surah 359 makes claims to Jesus being created like Adam from dust and the word be. Surah 1935 also explicitly denies any form of sonship of Jesus to the Father. Again, you can attempt to pin this on new revelation given to Muhammad, but this exact stream of thought had already been condemned by the people of the book in the 2nd, 3rd and 4th centuries. In the 2nd century, a small sect called the Ebionites arose, which many church fathers opposed, who denied that Jesus was the Son of God amongst some other things. Ebionism was defined as a heretical doctrine which manipulated scripture. Then around the 4th century, another offshoot of Christianity started to rise up, stating that Jesus was not actually divine, but a created being, mirroring the Quran's approach to this matter. This was called Arianism, condemned as a heresy at the First Council of Nicaea and Constantinople. When it comes to the belief in the Trinity, the Quran actually does something interesting. Firstly, it outright denies that God is a Trinity and reiterates throughout that Allah cannot and does not beget, having no equals beside him, and that God is only one person. Again though, this belief isn't new. It's called Unitarianism, which was also believed in by many condemned heretical offshoots through the 3rd to 5th centuries. Why were they condemned? Well, because the God of Abraham through divine revelation and previous scripture, appealed to by Muhammad, had taught his people something different. In the midst of denying the triune nature of God, going against the Injil of the time, the Quran actually completely misrepresents and distorts the Christian position on the Trinity too. The question becomes again, who is it that Muhammad spoke to? Or what did he observe to give him the idea that the following was the case? Surah 573 says that Christians say that Allah is the third of three. However, that's not the case. Christians actually condemned this position as a heresy called tritheism, with small sects by the early 7th century suggesting that the Trinity was three separate gods, condemned at the Third Council of Constantinople. We could go on and on with doctrine in the Quran which differs to those of Christianity from the 7th century, but for time's sake I'll show you just one more thing. The Quran, although claiming to be sourced in divine revelation, actually looks to incorporate Gnostic texts and fables into its doctrine. For example, the Quran says that Jesus created birds out of clay, which is parallel to the infancy gospel of Thomas. It also states that Jesus spoke from the cradle, which mirrors again the infancy gospel of Thomas and the Arabic infancy gospel. The denial of the crucifixion and death of Jesus, which we've already looked at, has parallel sources such as the second treatise of the great Seth and the Apocalypse of Peter. All of these parallel texts that I've just mentioned are sourced in Gnosticism, not new divine revelation. So I'll ask again, were the early church fathers wrong in stating that the origin of Islam is simply the perversion and distortion of Christianity rather than true revelation from God? When analysing the text, we see that objectively, the Quran changes the doctrines of the Injil and Torah that it roots itself in, whilst Muhammad proclaims doctrines which are at enmity with those of the very Abrahamic faith and God that he claims to be a prophet of. The Quran also objectively is littered with doctrine which mirrors condemned Christian heretical groups of the time, which Muhammad would have likely come into regular contact with through his location and occupation. But here's what we can conclude. Again, the Quran and Muhammad root themselves in previous scriptures and the Abrahamic faith. This means that if the source of Islam is divine revelation, it will complement and work hand in hand with said scriptures and religion. However, we objectively see a distortion and perversion of the previous scriptures that it makes claim to, and the very Abrahamic faith that Muhammad roots himself to. The distortion isn't simply new revelation either, but much of it mirrors a mixture of already condemned Christian heresies of the past. Therefore, if the Abrahamic faith is true, Islam's origins is not of it, and therefore Muhammad's revelation is not from God. It would be fair to conclude then that many church fathers, the earliest critics of Islam, were not wrong in their conclusions of its origins.